My friends, welcome to this episode of the Outdoor Gear Review. Today I am reviewing one of the worst wood burning stoves I've ever tested out. In fact, I'm doing something that I never ever do. I just got this product in. I just fired it up for the first time after one test. I can tell you that this is the worst wood stove I've ever used, ever. The design of this is absolutely terrible in just about every single way. In fact, there's only 3 pros for this stove. Everything else is negative. This is the Wadeo Wood Burning Stove, and folks, don't buy this. If you purchase the Wadeo stove, this is what you get. You get the stove itself, which I will go to in just a minute and focus on. You get this storage bag. In addition, you get a pocket bellows. What this is a telescoping pipe, kind of like an antenna on your car. And you use this to blow oxygen into the stove to really get your fire going. In addition to the pocket bellows, you receive this little handsaw thing. I am sure you have seen these before. These are inexpensive, cheap. 99% of the time, these are garbage. Now everyone, let's focus on the stove here. This is made from 304 stainless steel. The weight of this is 2 pounds, 3.3 ounces. This is a big, heavy stove. Talking about big, the dimensions. This is 9.5 inches tall with the pot supports. At the bottom of the stove, this is 6.5 inches by 6.5 inches. At the top of the stove, this is 4.25 by 4.25. With the pot supports, you're looking at 5.5 inches from point to point. Diagonally, this is 8 inches. The price of this stove is $23 at the time of filming on Amazon. The company claims that you can use the following fuels with this stove: wood, charcoal, and solid alcohol. That's a new one on me. I have not heard that before. There are alcohol gels, but not solid alcohol. That really doesn't make any sense. We will talk more about those claims in just a moment. But for now, let's go ahead and take the stove apart and let's take a look at it. Let me show you all why this is a bad design. So first off, you have the 2 pot supports. They crisscross up at the top. Down here, you have the burner plate. And check this out. It comes in 2 pieces. I've never seen that before. Next, look at the size of the holes here. That presents a huge problem, and we'll come back to it. Here's the body of the stove. You have air holes at the top. You have the feed hole at the very bottom. The stove doesn't fall apart once the burner plate's gone, but it's not stable either. With the burner plate inside of this, it's not stable as well. And that's because these burner plates do not lock into place. They simply just slide into place, and they could be easily dislodged. When they're in place, there's still quite a bit of flex and wobble to this. In fact, the only way to get this secure, to get it really stable, is to lock in the pot supports. You can see there just how flat this stove folds. Very, very flat. And then it goes inside of this case, which is roughly 10 inches by 8 inches. Now everyone, let's take the stove and let's put it back together. This is an easy process. This is one that is basically tried and true. There are literally 1,000 stoves that copy this basic design. So there you have it. That's the basic overall shape. It's wider at the bottom and tapers towards the top. Now it's time for the burner plates. With the burner plates, you can see a notch here and you can see a notch there. They notch into the sides of the stove. So they go in just like so, and they notch into place. They go in, notch into place, and that's that. Focusing on these plates here, you can see just how easily they pop out of place. I mean, all it takes is for you to just knock this and they will come out. This really is a very, very poor design. Factor in these holes here, I mean, it just gets worse and worse. It's all of the holes in the base plate that make this stove super dangerous. And that's because of all of the burning tinder that's falling through those holes. With the burner plates installed, you can see here just how much flex the stove has. If you're rough with this, you can knock those out. So let's move on over to the pot supports. You can see here the interesting design that these have and the way that they're staged. So these connect on each side and then over the top of each other. And that holds this stove in place. It does give it some rigidity. Again, you have to be careful with these burner plates though, because you can knock those out. That's the bottom of the stove there. And as you can see, I just knocked that one out. Actually, both of them out. I want you all to focus on just how awkward it is to actually load this up. The first big problem that you will notice are those gigantic holes down in the burner plate. All of your small material will fall through those holes. The next big problem that you will notice is the feeding hole itself. Oftentimes when you're dropping materials in, you're trying to build it up, they will fall through this hole. So I'm going to take this off to start with. As you're loading this up, you're putting in your fuel, you will see that it's falling into the stove, straight through those holes in the bottom. You can also see how much debris is falling through down at the bottom. I'm doing my best to prevent that, but it's going to happen. Because the stove is so big, it really does have to be packed full so that you can get a good base of embers. If you don't pack it full, the base of embers won't be enough to burn larger pieces of wood. Before you light the stove up, it is my advice that you reattach the legs. It's easier to do this now rather than later when this is burning, because once this gets started, flames are going to be jutting out of this. At this point, the fire is just getting started. Everything looks all well and good, right? Well, you're about to see some serious problems with this stove. We have a flame that's jutting out about 15 inches above the stovetop. Let's go ahead and let's get a pot on there. Let's get some water going. Once you have the pot on here, you really can see the issues with the feeding port. First off, the stove itself is blocking much of the top here. So now the flames of the fire are actually jutting out of the front of the stove. And that's because of overall poor airflow inside of the stove. On the body here, there's no holes. You only have holes in the very bottom and up at the top. So what happens? The air that's circulating underneath here is pushing the flame out the front. Again, I can't take those pieces of wood and shove them in very far because the stove is so hot. I know what you're thinking. What about feeding it from the top? Well, you can, kind of, but your pieces of wood tend to get stuck up here, especially as you go with larger and larger pieces of wood. What about this hole here? Well, it's the same issue. You could shove small pieces of wood in there fairly easy. But bigger and longer pieces of wood become a problem, and that's because they get stuck just like that. Larger pieces of wood in the top, that does not work. Not really at all. That is dangerous. You really are forced to feed this stove through the bottom hole here. But even with everything that's burned so far, there's really not enough embers in there to burn this wood quickly. It's going to take quite a while for this to ignite. Let's say that you have a good base of embers, you have some burning wood. You have to take your wood that you're feeding this stove and push it up into the stove. And that's because you can't drop the wood and the materials from above. You have to push it in and up on top of those embers. So terrible, look at that. Take a look underneath the stove here. You can see all of that burning debris underneath. You can see how much has fallen out through those holes and has actually rolled out. Like this piece of wood right here. This has been burned up and it fell out of that stove. I think we have boiling water now. Yes, we do. Now let's move over to a smaller pot. So you might be able to see this, but the smaller pot doesn't sit very well on these pot supports because of the way that the pot supports are notched. Because you can't get the larger pieces of wood into the stove, you can see that it actually burns its way out. So you constantly have to adjust this, and as you adjust this, you're pushing burning debris beneath the stove. With most wood stoves, the feeding port is higher up so that you could take the wood and you could drop it in on top of your fire. That way you don't have to expose your hands and your fingers and your gloves to the flame. But that's not the case with this stove. You have to put your hand basically right into the stove, right up next to it, to feed it. And again, as you're feeding it, you're knocking down all of that loose burning material underneath this stove. You could see here, everybody, just how much debris has fallen out of this stove and has blown around. I mean, it's a lot. Look at that. Personally, I don't like the way that you have to feed this stove, because this is what you have to do with the larger pieces of wood. You have to leave them sticking out of the stove itself, because there's no way to feed the stove from the top. So it has to go in and up. And basically, you have to feed these sticks, and you have to pay attention. You have to be able to push these in as they burn. Otherwise, the fire will escape the stove. All in all, folks, this is a very dangerous design. And I don't like this one bit. I mean, if you want a stove that can start a forest fire, this is it. You can see all of those embers and ashes blowing around. To use this stove, you need to use large pots. They work the best with this rather strange pot support system. The way that it's staged doesn't work very well. You could take the pot supports off, but you're going to dampen this stove at the same time. That's not something that I would recommend. Now everyone, let's talk about what I like about this stove. As I mentioned before, I only have a handful of pros for this. First off, it's easy to put together. This is not complicated. Anyone can do this, and it doesn't take all that long. The next pro for this stove is that it does cool quickly. Next, the materials themselves are rather robust. This is thick gauge steel, and those are the pros that I have for this stove. That's where it ends there. Overall, the design of this stove is the worst that I've ever seen, and it is unique. In fact, I've never seen a stove designed this way for good reason, because it doesn't make any sense. Having the feed port at the very bottom makes no sense. Having the two-piece burner plate that pops out that can be dislodged makes no sense. The pot support design, the way that it's staged, makes no sense. In addition to the terrible design, which I've already gone over extensively, is the fact that this stove is dangerous. The fact that there's so many holes in that bottom burner plate, or the burner plates, I mean, you'll light this thing up and all of your small debris will fall through that, catching the ground on fire if there's any dry material there. Look at all of that burning debris that has fallen through this stove. This is not a stove that you want to take to like very dry areas. With areas that are prone with like forest fires and whatnot, forget about this stove. The only thing to remember about this stove is that it's terrible. Don't buy it. I purchased this with my own money, so you don't have to. I was drawn to the interesting looking pot supports, which have turned out to be really just more gimmick than anything else. The staged levels, that is not conducive with most pots and pans. The next con that I have for this stove is the materials themselves. While good, they're not very polished, so the edges are sharp. The bottom edges, especially with like where the feet are, they're super sharp. So you need to pay attention where you put this. Let's say that you're at your house, you have this stove, you just put it together for the first time, you lay it down on your kitchen table, right? You go to move it, you pull it across the table, it will scratch the living hell out of your table. I cannot tell you why I know this, but trust me, it will. The next two cons that I have for this stove are rather funny, and they deal with the claims that the company makes. So check this out. The stove is empty. I'm putting a pot up top. The company claims you can use this with alcohol stoves, which is absolutely nonsensical. That is how they show using this. So you put your stove down way down there, and the heat is supposed to rise up and heat up your water. This is nonsensical. The flame is simply too far away from the pot. The company also claims that you can take a solid fuel cube, put this inside of the stove, and heat up your water, which is again completely nonsensical. When it comes to this stove, this is a great example of a company that's willing to say anything, do anything to make a sale. The design is terrible. It's super dangerous in many ways. This is just a terrible stove. Don't buy it. Watch this review, have a good laugh, and move on. Again, folks, don't buy this. There's much better stoves out there. In fact, I've reviewed many excellent wood burning. In fact, I have reviewed many good wood. That's a tongue twister. In fact, I have reviewed many good wood burning stoves. I got it that time. So, yeah, I'm done. Make sure to hit the thumbs up if you like this episode. Also, make sure to comment down below and share your thoughts. What do you all think about the Wadeo Wood Burning Stove? You can support the channel here on YouTube or Patreon. I do appreciate it. Everybody, take care, be well, strength and honor. Bye for now.